happy to hear. And actually, I didn't say this good morning to, I know you guys, it's morning over there in Beijing. So I want to say good morning. And again, thank you so much for this opportunity. I hope that, what I share will be helpful as we move forward, learning more and discovering more about how tacit knowledge can be an important vehicle to help us, expand the field of knowledge management. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So yes. So I want to kind of just give you a little bit of a sense of what I'm going to use, the time I'm going to use, for the next 30 minutes. I want to say that I am going to talk a little bit about the connection between narrative and tacit knowledge. This is how are they connected? What are the connections that exist between both of them? The other thing that I want to talk about is, I'm sorry, can we go back to the agenda slides? Yes, okay, perfect. The other thing I want to talk about is the knowledge, where is tacit knowledge in a narrative situation? So I'll take a minute to explain what do I mean by a narrative situation, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what things we need to pay attention to if we are, as knowledge management practitioners, if we want to implement storytelling, but from a perspective in which we can capture and use narratives. So, okay, now I'm going to go to the next slide to begin the presentation. So as we move to that, yes, thank you so much. So the first thing that I want to say in this discussion is I like to start my discussions about narratives and storytelling by just taking a moment to explain that in my work and in this context, I'm going to use stories and narratives interchangeably. I look at them as pretty much the same concepts. In some domains, in some knowledge domains, there is a little bit of a nuance, a little bit of a distinction, a tiny distinction between stories and narratives, but that is more, that happens, or that distinction is appreciated in other fields of knowledge. But within knowledge management, when we talk about narratives and stories, we're talking essentially about the same. So I wanted to take a moment to kind of make sure that we start on that basis, that I'm using both interchangeably. The other thing that I wanted to do as I begin this conversation is to begin the conversation with the same question I use for all my workshops and every time I talk about storytelling, which is the foundational question: what is storytelling? And I usually like to go to the simplest definition just to make it easy for everybody so we can start on a common ground. So basically, storytelling is the telling of an experience. Stories are about experiences, are about events. Something happened and somebody's telling you about that thing which happened, either to them or to others. So basically, storytelling is when people are telling somebody about something that happened. It's a very simple definition. It's about events, it's about things, experiences. So now I want to take us to think about, when we talk about stories, I want to take a moment for us to think, we are surrounded by stories. As Kate was mentioning just a second ago, we live in a world of stories. I call it, and I haven't coined the word, but I know the word is out there. We live in a storyverse, meaning that we're surrounded by stories. We as individuals carry many stories, and we're surrounded by people who have stories. So let's think about us in an organization, in a company, in an institution, large or small. That institution, that organization, that corporation is filled with stories. How did the company become what it is? How did the company expand? The discovery, the invention of products, the different divisions within that company. The company is filled with stories. So what I do, my work as a knowledge management practitioner and storytelling strategist has been to take a look at how we can use those narratives as a way to share knowledge, share critical knowledge. That's the thing that I've always been sort of interested in and concerned with. So the reason why this is important, you may say, well, why is it important to think about narratives and stories, within an organization? It's important because, and I try to show this a little bit of this and graphically, it's important for one reason. First, stories, as we know them, they are a reflection of our experiences. So when you're telling a story, as I said at the beginning, you're telling the story of an experience. So the stories are reflections of our experiences. And those experiences, the things that happened to us, the things that we did, the things that we learned, the things that we worked on, those experiences are the ones that generate knowledge, that the ones that generate that tacit knowledge. And that knowledge is the basis of the story. So when you're telling the story of a particular process or procedure within an organization, you're telling the story. The story is the reflection of that experience. And that is the experience that generated the knowledge. And again, like I said, that knowledge is the one that was the basis of the experience. So that's why I wanted to take this minute, this moment to talk about that connection, because the organizations are now realizing the power of stories to transfer critical knowledge. But we're at a juncture now where the more organizations are starting to look towards stories as a way to generate and transfer tacit knowledge, the more we understand that we need to provide them with tools and ways for them to be able to do this effectively. So now that we kind of have this basis in terms of what is the connection between the story, the experience, and knowledge, specifically tacit knowledge, I want to now take a moment to go now to the section where I'm going to talk about the narrative situation. So I'm going to ask our assistant if they're able to move us to the next slide. Yes. So now I'm going to take a minute here just to kind of walk us through what this means, and I'm going to take some time here to make sure that it really resonates with what our audience is debating and analyzing around the concept of tacit knowledge. So when I talk about the connection between narratives and tacit knowledge, the way that I look at this is by thinking about the context. Where do you find tacit knowledge when you're talking about narrative? So that place where you find it is what I call the narrative situation. So let me take a moment to explain what is the narrative situation. So the narrative situation is that moment in which a story is shared between the storyteller or a source and the audience. That exchange, that moment when knowledge flows from the storyteller to the audience, that exchange between them, that communication between them, that's the narrative situation where a story that is filled with knowledge is emanating from the storyteller to the audience, that we use that story, the knowledge in that story, to accomplish a particular goal, whether it is training, whether it is solving a problem, etc. And we'll talk about the uses of the story later. So I want to make sure that we kind of have that concept or that idea clear. So that narrative situation is that moment, that communicative moment where the story goes from one source to the other. But I want to take a moment when I talk about the narrative situation to give you a clear example. You may have seen comedians, for example, talk to audiences, tell jokes or tell stories to audiences. When they are talking to the audience, there is a communication between them. There is a feedback loop. In my book, Narrative, the Knowledge Management and the Practice of Storytelling, I talk about the fact that when somebody tells the story and they're presenting the story to an audience, there's a kind of a dance between the storyteller and the audience, where the storyteller brings the story to the audience and the audience brings its attention. So the storyteller gives you the story and the audience gives in turn its attention. But it's more than just its attention. There is a feedback. When the storyteller is telling the story, they are seeing how the audience is reacting, how the audience is reacting to certain parts of the story. So that dance between the audience and the storyteller, that is what we call that narrative situation. And it's more evident when you have those stories that are told live to an audience. So now that we have a sense of what that narrative situation is, Now let's take it apart. So the narrative situation, like I said, is made up of the storyteller's tacit knowledge and the audience's tacit knowledge. So before I go into explaining the difference, I just want to take a moment to explain why is it important to talk about the narrative situation. The importance of this concept within the discussion is because the narrative situation is that key moment where tacit knowledge is exchanged. That dance that we talked about, that feedback loop, that communication, that is the bridge where knowledge is elicited from the storyteller and received, understood, accepted by the audience, and vice versa. And we'll see that in a minute. So the storyteller then, when we think about the storyteller telling the story, why is there the person that is telling the story, why is their tacit knowledge important? And I'm sure just by thinking about it, you may already have a sense of what I'm going to say. The storyteller that is the person telling the story, they come to us with the story, but the story is the result of their experience. They are the person who experienced the event or they witnessed the event. So they're telling us a story that they were part of or an event that they witnessed. So that in itself already, when they're telling us the story is part of their tacit knowledge because they had the story before they shared it with others. So when they're telling us the story, that in itself is already them unleashing tacit knowledge. And why is tacit knowledge an important element in the storyteller's, from the storyteller's perspective? Because they're telling us the story, but the story is also the product of memory, what you remember, especially if you think about an event or if you think about a process. Another part that is really critical when you talk about storytelling and about the storyteller and how they can unleash tacit knowledge is when the storyteller is telling us the storyteller is also, there is also feelings and emotions connected to that. For example, one of the things that I like to do when I do storytelling interviews to capture stories, I like to ask the storyteller, the person telling me the story, how did it feel? How did it feel to go through that process? What was going through your mind? So think about it this way. If you are listening to the story of an astronaut telling you about the moment when they blasted off and they were going up into space, wouldn't it be interesting to know what was going through your mind? How did it feel? How did it feel in your body? That itself is tacit knowledge that normally you probably wouldn't hear if you just read a story about the astronauts blasting off into space. So that aspect of the storyteller telling us how it felt, what was going through their mind, how did it make them feel before, after, during, all of that, that is tacit knowledge. And sometimes that is more likely to unfold when, or to be elicited when, for example, the storyteller is telling the story to an audience that is responding. If the storyteller is telling a story and they see that the audience is responding to a particular aspect of the story, they might feel inclined to share more, give more details. That is the source of tacit knowledge there, where if they didn't have that feedback, maybe they wouldn't share that additional information that could be critical. That is tacit knowledge that comes through storytelling, but it comes through when you have that communication, when that narrative situation is present. Another thing that's important about the storyteller is when the storyteller is telling the story, the judgments, the decisions. For example, think about this situation where you're watching a movie and you see the character going into a room where the assassin is waiting for them and you're screaming and saying, no, 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 don't go in there. If the person is telling the story, you would ask them, why did you go in there if you knew there was danger in there? Those decisions, those judgments, that is tacit knowledge that only comes through when you tell a story, when you're able to be in a situation when you can tell talk about that context. So the narrative situation allows us to get the context, and that context is where tacit knowledge lies. And then the final thing about the storyteller is when the storyteller is telling the story, their perception of the audience that they're speaking to is also very important. What they think and understand of the audience can affect how they tell the story. If you think of an accountant telling a story to a room full of other accountants, the person telling the story already has a sense of what they know as a whole in terms of their background knowledge. So there are things that that person may not say because they already know that that audience already knows that, or they have that background context. So the perception of the audience that the storyteller has is also a source of tacit knowledge, and determines how much to share in the story, how many details to give. So that's why this is very important when you think about tacit knowledge from the perspective of the person telling the story. Now, let's take a moment to look at the audience telling the story. So remember, the tacit narrative situation is made up of the storyteller and the audience. So the audience is also a player in this situation. The audience also has tacit knowledge. The audience comes to the story with a background knowledge. They have, for example, if the story is a story about diplomacy, or if the story is about information technology or artificial intelligence, and it's a room where people have that knowledge or some understanding of that, they come to the story with their own background experience. So that is also important, because the connections that they make between the story and their background experience, that is also an element where tacit knowledge can be shared. The audience, which is made up of people, also comes to the story with their own memories of things that are similar to the story. That's why storytelling is so important, because when you tell a story, and that story connects with the audience, it connects with the audience because the story hits elements of the person's experience and memory. People will remember things. Elements in the story will make you remember things that you went through that could also trigger tacit knowledge, help you remember processes that you didn't, or even workarounds that you had used before, that suddenly comes back to your memory. The other thing that is important is the audience, like the storyteller, has emotions. They might react positively or negatively. Remember, I said at the beginning, when you're telling the story as a storyteller and you see that the audience, visually in their bodies, they're not understanding or they're reacting negatively to your story, then as the storyteller, you may want to think, well, maybe this is not getting to them the right way, or maybe I'm missing a critical component. So the audience has, obviously the audience has emotions, and they have beliefs and values. So the story has to appeal to those so that they can make those connections. If the audience sees the story as believable, then there is a greater chance that the audience can make connections with their own experience that can then elicit that tacit knowledge. And then the final thing that I want to say on this aspect is the perception that the audience has of the storyteller is just as important as the perception that the storyteller has of the audience. So if the storyteller is a credible source, is a credible storyteller, meaning they're talking about something that they know about, that it's a topic that it's not something, it's something that sounds honest, sincere, credible, then they're more likely to believe it. They're more likely to make those connections with their own experience. And it's in those connections, and that understanding that unfolds from listening to the story, that understanding is the one that triggers tacit knowledge. So I wanted to give you a sense of that, how the narrative situation is the one that really triggers and generates that connection that allows us to share tacit knowledge. Let's go to the next slide. So in this other slide, as we move forward towards the middle of this discussion, is when, let's say, as a knowledge management practitioner, you decide that you would like to use stories, use narratives to capture tacit knowledge in your organization. And you figure, well, what things do you need to know? What are the basic things? There's a number of things that you would probably want to consider. But if I were to say, these are the 5 things that you at least need to begin thinking about as you think about how to use stories, I would say, like I said, there are 5 elements that you would want to consider. The first one is the selection. What are the stories that you're going to use? Are you going to use stories that are about success? Are you going to use stories that are about lessons learned or failures? Or are you going to use stories about how the organization was founded, or how a project began, or how a product was developed and conceived and launched. So the first thing to consider is what stories? What are the stories that you will use? What are those narratives that contain critical knowledge that can unleash that tacit knowledge? Then the next thing that I want to show you is the objective. I can tell you, I've worked in many organizations where people decide that they want to do, they want to implement a storytelling initiative, but but it's not clear why they're doing it. So and especially if you're trying to convince the senior or executive leadership in an organization about the value of using stories to share and capture tacit knowledge, it's important to have a clear objective. Are you going to use the stories, for example, to enhance training, for upskilling, to share information about critical issues? What is the objective? What do you want to pursue? The other thing that as you've heard me mentioning before, that is important here, the other thing that is important is the audience analysis. You want to make sure that you take a moment to understand the audiences, because an organization, like any organization, is made up of many cultures. There is not one organizational culture. There are multiple cultures within an organization, multiple cultures and subcultures. Just like there are many cultures, there are many audiences. So the first thing is figure out who is your audience, meaning which is the audience that will receive that story that you're capturing to share with them. And then the thing is, what is who is that audience? What do they value? What are the things that they prefer? What is their experience using or listening to stories? Like I said, it's important to get an understanding. In many workshops that I've engaged, we've done activities where we just take a moment to analyze the audience. We do things like an empathy analysis to understand who the audience is, because once you have that understanding, then the likelihood of success in terms of using the story is much greater. And then the other element here is the format. How will you deliver the story? I like to take a moment I like to remember the phrase from Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. And really, this is important. When you tell the story, the format is just as important as the story in terms of sharing tacit knowledge. So for example, if you're thinking of sharing stories in a graphical format, for example, if you have an infographic or panels in a storyboard, how do the illustrations, the images in those graphics, how do they share, enhance or trigger the sharing of tacit knowledge? So this is also important. And then the final point here that I think is the most important one, and as a knowledge management practitioner, I always pay attention to this. If you capture stories, let's say you find the right story, you have your objectives, you've analyzed the audience, and you've identified the right delivery format. My question then is, how will you use that story? Remember, I mentioned in the beginning, you want to have an objective. So how will that story that you've captured, that tacit knowledge that you've captured, how will that be connected to a critical operation in the organization? In other words, how do you apply that? How do you connect that to the day-to-day, to what some people call the in the flow of work? How do you connect it to the in the flow of work? That is very, very important, because you don't want to, this is a two-part process. It's the capturing of the story, the sharing of the story, and then the third part, the application of the story. So I want you to kind of take a moment to look at these 5 elements that you want to pay attention to if you want to kind of begin a process where you're looking at how you could use stories to insert them into the day-to-day of your organization as a way to share and capture tacit knowledge. So now that we've had that, I want to go to the final slide, because I want to take some time. I'm going to spend a few minutes on this one. And I put these questions here because these are some of the questions that I have had people ask me over the years in terms of, or that I have asked other people over the years when we have worked on using stories to capture tacit knowledge or and share it within the organization. So, the first thing, and I want to use these questions also as a way to challenge the audience that is listening. For those of you who are out there that may consider using stories, the first question that I want to ask you is, what are the typical stories of your organization? So I want you to take a moment to think about that. How, if you've ever heard the stories told in your organization, what are the typical ones? What are the ones that you hear over and over? This is very important because this can give you a sense of what the organization values. What the organization values in many ways is reflected in the stories that are told, at least the stories that are told institutionally. So what are the typical stories that are heard in your organization? It's always, when you begin thinking about storytelling, you kind of want to start at that point. Are there stories that are told and collected? Are they collected in a way that people hear about them? Are they shared? And if so, what are those stories? So I always say to people that it's always good to do somewhat of an inventory of stories within the organization to kind of get a sense of what they are, if they haven't already been, if somebody hasn't done that sort of inventory. Then the other thing that I add, the other question is, how are stories used in your organization? Are they used to train people? Are they used to illuminate complicated processes? So that's another important aspect. If the stories are shared, how are they used? Then the other thing that I ask people is, where are the stories that provide access to critical tacit knowledge? So if you're going to collect stories, like I said before, we're surrounded by stories, but not all the stories are stories that we need. So first of all, what are the stories that we need, and where are those stories? For example, are the stories can you find critical stories in company retreats or all hands meetings or founders meetings? Where are these stories, and for you to be able to get access to those? That's one of the first questions that I ask, at least myself, when I do storytelling interviews. I have to find the stories and the people who tell the stories. So I have to figure out within that organization, within that company, where are the places that I can find these stories? Then the other thing that is important is, whose voices carry the stories of your organizations? Who are the people that are talking about, think about a story about a project, and one person tells the story about a particular project, how it unfolded. But then what if somebody else tells the same story? They will have a different perspective because their experience of that same project may vary. So tacit knowledge will also vary in how it unfolds if two people see the same process in a different way. And then finally, what can you do to connect stories to the critical operations of your organization? So if you collect stories, or if you are able to capture stories, how do you connect them to your day-to-day organization, to the operations that reflect the day-to-day in your organization? So these are some of the questions that I wanted us to think about as we move towards the end of this presentation. And I want to go to the next slide just to move towards the final part. As we move to the next slide, I want to say that a lot of this work that I've been thinking about in terms of stories, I reflect about it in my book, Knowledge Management and the Practice of Storytelling. And the reason why I'm mentioning the book is because I wrote this book precisely to talk about how we can use stories to elicit tacit knowledge. What are the things that we need? What are the skills that we need to be able to do that? For example, one of them that I mentioned is, how do you develop and conduct a storytelling interview to capture stories and elicit stories from others? How do you put together a story that will allow you to understand and share tacit knowledge with an audience? These are some of the things that I've been looking at as I move forward in this lifelong commitment to researching and understanding how stories can impact knowledge sharing in organizations. And the final slide, I just want to say, as we move to the final slide, I just want to say thank you to everybody for listening. If you want to learn more about me, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter, and you can email me at the email address there, which is connected to my company, StoryDNX. Thank you so much. Thank you, Fisher, for the opportunity. And I hope that, we've been able to, that some of what I've shared has been of help to people in the out in your community.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much, Joel. This is a wonderful speech. And actually, I want to read your book, The Knowledge Management and the Practice of Storytelling. Excellent. And I think this is a great, you share some practical things about 5 elements, how to capture the storyline, the knowledge. This is great. So we do have several minutes.